Are African countries getting into a debt trap with China? President Xi Jinping hosts another high-level meeting of African leaders and promises there are no strings attached to billions of dollars in new financing. But what are the long-term financial risks? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. China is Africa's largest trading partner and has already spent billions of dollars in investment and loans, with the promise of much more to come. From roads and railways to ports, the Chinese government is backing large-scale projects across Africa as part of its so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the leaders of around 50 African countries have been in Beijing for a two-day summit. China's President Xi Jinping offered them $60 billion in new financing deals and says the investments come with no political strings attached. He's also promising to waive the debts of the poorest African countries. Here's our China correspondent, Adrian Brown.
Well, this has been a summit which in many ways was more about symbolism than substance. It lasted really less than 2 days. But of course, China has committed itself to giving Africa another $60 billion. That's on top of the $60 billion that was pledged at the last Africa-China Forum 3 years ago. China's media actually doesn't call this, loans. It talks about aid. That way, it doesn't seem as though China is making a profit out of extending financing to Africa. But of course, these are loans. Now, President Xi Jinping said that, $15 billion of that $60 billion was going to be free of interest. But of course, it still means that Africa will be paying interest on $45 billion worth of loans. Now, China has been very sensitive to criticism that it's carrying out what is known as debt diplomacy. China says, in fact, that, African countries are not in debt because of the money that China has been lending. It's the result of money that has been lent by others. And Chinese officials on the sidelines of this summit have been pressing home that point again and again. I've also been struck by what's been said on social media, and there really is quite a bit of anger out there. A number of messages have now been deleted from Weibo. That's China's equivalent of Twitter. Many people in China actually don't go along with President Xi Jinping's international ambitions. And what people are saying is, China is a developing country. Maybe some of that money should have gone back to China. This is Adrian Brown for Inside Story in Beijing.
OK, let's bring in our panel now. And joining us from Beijing, we have Wang. She's an analyst at the Economist intelligence unit. In Rabat, Lahcen Haddad is a Moroccan former minister and member of parliament. And from Nairobi, Aly-Khan Satchu, an investment advisor at Rich Management. Very good to have you all with us. Warm welcome to the programme. Mr. Haddad, if I could start with you. It was very impressive, isn't it, to get around 50 heads of African states to Beijing. Did the leaders all get what they wanted?
I think so, and it's very impressive first, because a lot of people go to those kinds of meetings, whether it's in Africa or in China, and African leaders are interested in China because now it's becoming like a major global player, especially with the problems that Europe has been having lately, and also the rising protectionism in America under Trump. So a lot of Africans look at China, and China has been delivering in this sense since 2000. In terms of loans, in terms of investment, in terms of development aid, which is becoming bigger. And I think it's fair to say that the Chinese are aware of the fact that they need to be, to change the model of financial help that they are providing. For example, if you look at the $60 billion that they pledged only $20 billion is credit line, but $15 billion is concessional and interest-free, $10 billion is for development, and $5 billion is to help with imports, and $10 billion will be like from the private sector. So all of that is very important in the sense that the Africans are seeing that China is not only interested in making money and also in extracting like resources, but they are more interested in improving, if you like exports to China, not only primary kind of exports, but also like manufactured exports. And there is talk about development, about sustainability. So all of those kinds of things are important. And I think the Africans also, the African leaders are very sensitive to the fact that these kinds of loans and then development money comes without political strings as it comes from Western countries. So that's the interest in China. But also, I think that China has a lot of money to spend as well. And for it, like Africa is an emergent region with a lot of potential and a lot of growth coming its way. So there is that interest also from the Chinese, whether it's the Chinese government and also the Chinese companies. And China is interested in bringing Africa within that kind of perspective of the Silk Road, or the reinvention of the Silk Road.
Absolutely.
That the Chinese president has put together.
Dan Wang, how interested is China really in developing a different kind of relationship? Or are these changes that it's made, the pledging of $60 billion, of which $45 billion, according to our correspondent, is still in the form of loans that carry with it interest rates and penalties for non-repayments? So how interested is China really in changing the relationship?
Well, I don't think the general direction of the relationship has any real changes, but there's some interesting language change because previously China focused more on the poverty reduction and in line with that. But this year, capacity building is mentioned multiple times, which suggests actually China is more interested into injecting more of the manufacturing capacity and more, even part of China's supply chain over to African countries. And this is a positive change, I would say. And in terms of the loans, China is also a bit more conservative in terms of providing concessional loans, and a lot more focus is on building up the trade link between the two continents, and that's also positive.
Okay, Aly-Khan Satchu, do you agree with this? Do you see a new era in China-Africa relations developing here?
I think there's definitely been a linguistic change. I think Xi Jinping, who fried his propaganda chief, I think about 2 weeks ago, has definitely changed the language around Africa, around the African story. But I think, we cannot be naive at this point in time. We've seen countries take on enormous amounts of debt. We've seen hugely inflated infrastructure projects, many of which are white elephants before the get-go. And you don't have to look very far, whether it's Gwadar in Pakistan, whether it's Tonga, whether it's Sri Lanka, who gorged on Chinese credit and then had to disgorge their port at Hambantota. We can see the writing on the wall and where this is headed. So I think definitely Xi Jinping is situationally more aware. But I think, some of these deals that were offered in the $60 billion package had collateral benefits for China. Take some of the debt forgiveness for Indian Ocean islands, which he specified. That's all about geopolitical reach. These islands have a lot of reach in terms of the sea around them. So I think, what I do find, there is a rah-rah, hurrah brigade, and it seems that they're very well coached when they all go to China. I wish they'd take some notes when they went. I didn't see a single leader of any African country taking any notes. It was quite extraordinary. So I think, look, there is a chorus, a clack, as it were, of people who will clap anything. But at the bottom line is, 20 years down the road, there are definite changes that have happened. Our countries have borrowed too much money. The projects they borrow these funds for are not going to pay off in the foreseeable future. And really, the key factor now for the Sino-African relationship is how China is going to deal with the debt fallout. We can see the dominoes are beginning to fall. Zambia is a classic example. Prime Minister Abiy read the writing on the wall, notwithstanding 10% GDP rates. So really, I think we've got to be aware of what's going on. We cannot be naive. China is not Santa Claus, though a lot of our leaders seem to believe that. And we need to negotiate now with our national interest in mind. And I think these are the key things I'd like to see happen. I'm not seeing them happen yet. I'm just seeing a big cheerleading brigade. Great boondog in China shook his hand and they've come back. And I'm not sure what we've really got here.
OK. Dan Wang, just to pick up on one of the many points that Aly-Khan made there, is China a soft benefactor when it comes to these loans? Is it going to write them off as perhaps, a sort of Santa Claus? Or is it going to play hardball? As Aly-Khan said, we've seen in Sri Lanka where the Sri Lankans couldn't pay back the debt for this port and China then took over the lease for it.
Well, we all know that Chinese loans doesn't come with a lot of political strings, but it doesn't mean China has no conditions. In fact, over 50% of China's loans to Africa and Latin America is backed by commodity, things like energy and food. And it's very important for China to have some sort of backup. But overall, I don't think people should consider China as some sort of aid provider. Chinese entrepreneurs go over to African countries, build up factories, and change the landscape of Africa. It is out of their self-interest and not the fundamental thinking of helping African countries. I still think developed countries like US and Europe probably take really the moral high ground in this issue. But what really has changed in the past decade in Africa, we have to admit that Chinese is actually taking the lead here, not the Western countries.
Mr. Haddad, the big criticism, of course, over these projects is that many of them are simply not needed by many of these countries in Africa. They may benefit 20 years down the line, but they're certainly not benefiting anyone now. And when countries can't pay back the loans to pay for them in the first place, then they risk losing their sovereignty. Are you seeing that happen?
Some of the projects have been like what the Chinese president called vanity kind of projects, and they are carried out by some African leaders for their kind of political gains, and like big stadiums or big statues or big dams or different kinds of grandiose kinds of projects. But I think there is an awareness now, both among and the Chinese president said that, but also like among African leaders, and there is some sort of convergence now that you need to invest in like creation of wealth, in creation of employment, but also in sustainable kinds of projects. And I think that's the kind of language change that I'm seeing, and I'm seeing awareness on the part of the Chinese. Like 10 years before, they didn't care about those kinds of things. That sustainability was not on the table, but also like the nature of the projects was not on the table. But now it is on the table. And if you look at the speech of the Chinese president, you will see that's a very important kind. They have to be sustainable. They have also not to be to benefit the people, and that's important. So there is probably some sort of shift towards like more project that will be economically beneficial to the countries themselves rather than to regimes and to presidents.
OK, but what is interesting is that we're hearing this change of language from the Chinese side, from the Chinese President Xi Jinping, but we're not really necessarily hearing it from the African leaders' side. So what responsibility should leaders of Africa bear? For example, why are they not at this conference taking notes? Why are they at least giving the impression of just being a bunch of yes men?
I think that there is a very important drive and also very important need for funding and for investment. A lot of the African leaders that are there are dying to get those kinds of investment projects. They are not there to take notes or to take any kinds of lessons. They are there in order to see if they could fund like the different kinds of initiatives that they have undertaken, whether they are regional or they are national. So I think that's the most important thing. But the Chinese are there for that kind of if you look, for example, at the needs of Africa in terms of infrastructure, they have been evaluated sometimes at $100 billion kind of dollars. That's not something that will come from the US or will come from Europe. But China is there in order to fund those kinds of projects. And I think that's the most important thing for those countries. One of the things that needs to probably make everyone worried, and the World Bank and IMF also have signaled that, are those countries solvable? Will they be able to to pay those kinds of debts? What happens if they don't pay those debts? And I think the Chinese are smart in linking some of those debts to like commodities and also to having access to different kinds of resources within the continent. But I mean, it's something that we need to wait and see how much of an economic and political dependence will a lot of the countries that are not solvable in terms of that debt will be to China rather than to other countries, I mean, to Western countries like they have historically been.
Okay. Aly-Khan, can countries afford to wait and see what sort of debt they're going to be in to China, or is it already too late?
Well, I think in some cases it's too late, and in some cases the dominoes are falling. In Zambia, you got a Eurobond price at 70 cents in the dollar. If you follow the markets, that's telling you that basically Zambia's bust. Its biggest lender is China. So we're going to watch this situation now in real time unfold in front of our eyes. And there are a number of other situations which are very, very similar. If I can just return to the previous question in one way, I think China very much bet on the elites, on the leadership of the African continent. And what we're watching now is a very fluid moment. I'll just, I'm sitting in Nairobi. Just look at what's happening over the border in Uganda with the situation with President Museveni and Bobby Wine, this pop star who's very popular. And we're watching a generational shift from folks who fought for independence to the born-free generation. And when I listened to President Xi Jinping, it was quite sophisticated. He was talking about inclusive growth. He was talking about Africans feeling the growth on the street. And I think that's increasingly an important point that Xi Jinping is understanding, is that, this all-in bet, limit-long bet on leadership at a moment when leadership is about to be upended in many places is a very interesting moment for China to handle. And I think we've got to keep an eye on that. But look, make no mistake. I mean, these projects are not delivering the return on investment that they should be delivering. They're just simply not going to do it. In some cases, they're never going to do it. And the point is, what's going to happen when this becomes evident to many, many people? And we're seeing that evidence in front of our eyes. And I think that's the challenge for China. I also think we can't lose sight of the overall geopolitical situation. We've got President Trump rattling Xi Jinping's golden cage, looking to bottle up China and the South China Sea, not keen on an expansion into the Indian Ocean. So you've got a lot of other cross currents which are at play at the moment. And I think we've got to watch them all unfold. But it is a fluid situation, in my view.
And Wang, does that not concern China, that it's going to be saddled by all of these bad loans, which can never be repaid?
It is certainly a concern for China, especially when domestically it also face some liquidity problem. But we cannot say that infrastructure building is necessarily wrong in Africa. If I live in a village in remote Uganda, do I want a road that connects my village to the nearby township? Of course I do. But at some point, this loan might go sour, but I wouldn't be able to see it. Probably the later generation, our children or the children's children will have to repay the loan. But it doesn't mean that building this road is wrong. It probably will leave a lot of people out of poverty. And we cannot deny that China has gotten where it is now by the so-called China model, which is a debt-driven infrastructure spending model. And that has built the Chinese miracle in the past 40 years. And whether that model can be exported to Africa and whether African countries want to adopt it, it's a different question. But, the world has no patience. Really, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that China is willing to provide this kind of liquidity, and Xi Jinping considered this the Belt and Road Investment Initiative as a 1,000-year project for himself. So it's very important, actually, for the practical businessman to take advantage of this opportunity. It is just that when it's there, you just have to seize the day.
Okay, yeah, it certainly proved irresistible to many people on the African continent. Mr. Haddad, how has it benefited people in Morocco? Has Chinese investment benefited Morocco?
Well, Morocco is destination for Chinese investments, but it's not as big as South Africa or Nigeria or Algeria or Zambia or Angola, for example. So Morocco has had like a diversified kind of investors from both, like the US and also Europe and Middle East, especially. and China. So it's not highly dependent on China, although like it's very important, the relationships that exist between Morocco and China, I mean, politically, and also Morocco has been seen as a platform since it has also its own investments in Africa and its own interests in West Africa. But let me go back to the point that the previous point about regarding like the whether like these loans, I mean, like investments in infrastructure is very important, and I agree with the fact that roads and highways and also like ports and airports are very important, and they could be like structuring projects in the terms that they create some sort of dynamics around them. And I think the challenges for the Chinese is to go beyond the infrastructure and then work with the African governments on wealth producing kind of sectors. And I think agriculture is very important. Energy and mining, agriculture, technology. And the transformation that are happening in some countries like Zambia or Rwanda and other places, those are the kinds of transitions that should be accompanied by countries like China, so that there could be enough wealth creation, there can be enough jobs, but also there could be also enough taxes for the governments to pay back, I mean, like those kinds of debts. And I think that's the equation that needs to happen. I mean, from seeing, for example, the declaration of Chinese officials and the concerns of the Africans, I think that there is that kind of concern about the fact that, yes, infrastructure is important, yes, that should not be like big, but should be geared towards like infrastructure. But I think there is a need also to have like more focus on sectors that develop like wealth. And also, I mean, you look at Africa, and I think a lot of countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Angola, Rwanda, and others are, I mean, probably not Angola, but are growing, and some of them double digits. Okay. So I think there is prosperity to be created, to be enhanced in those kinds of countries. And I think the investment, if it's geared towards that kind of prosperity, will be beneficial.
Aly-Khan, do you see China willing to make that transition to invest in other areas of the economy and for this to become a more balanced relationship?
Absolutely, I think they have to, and you know, if I'm not knocking infrastructure, I'm just knocking the price tag, right? I'm saying, you know, a road is good if it's built to the village, but if it's built at the right price. If you're paying 3 times the price that the road costs, then you've got a problem. You've got a debt burden. So if we can contextualize it in that sense, I think, look, this relationship is dynamic. It's going to change. It's going to change dramatically. I think just the linguistics of President Xi Jinping at this conference are signaling that he's listening and that he's looking to turn. And I think the question is, does the bureaucracy turn with him? Do they listen to what he's saying? Or is it going to be more of the same, which is a rather freewheeling type attitude? A lot of contracts which ultimately have gone into financing elections. That's, you know, you've got these big ticket projects for infrastructure where money has been creamed off the top, recycled into winning the election and supporting the government of the day. So this is very, very obvious. So the question is, can President Xi Jinping clean up shop? Angola is a good example, because if you look back at the Chinese engagement with Angola, there was a very freewheeling type engagement. I think there was a very well-known character out of Hong Kong. I can't remember his name now. But you've seen Xi Jinping stamp his mark, try to sort of own the engagement much more, but he's going to have to take a lot more ownership over it, because for now, what we've seen is a lot of privileged people eating the Chinese cake. The question is, are the crumbs going to get down to 1 billion African citizens whose refrain has been throughout this 20-year expansion, we can't eat GDP? And I think that's what he was responding to, in point of fact.
Very interesting indeed. And I'm afraid there we will have to leave our discussion for today. Many thanks to all of you, Dan Wang, Lahcen Haddad and Aly-Khan Satchu. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.